Welcome to Lecture 1 on the module on sexuality. Let's get into it. So, before the feminist movement, before sexual liberation, most women found it difficult, if not downright impossible, to assert healthy sexual agency. For a long time, and it's something that we talk about in regards to the feminist movement, women were seen by the eyes of the law, as well as by many, particularly Western societies, as property and supporting male dominance. So, this meant that sexist thinking to females from birth on had made it clear that the domain of sexual desire and sexual pleasure was and always was only male, that only a female of little or no virtue would lay claim to her sexual need or sexual hunger. And this continued for a long time, and even still to today, that there has been a lack of sort of sexual agency, particularly as it pertains to women in the law and in the state. Broadly speaking, in the context of Europe and North America, before the first wave of feminism, the suffrage movement, the fight to get the right to vote, or as I explained before, demanding a seat at the table and being recognized legally as a full person, laws protecting women's sexual autonomy were very minimum and mostly skewed to male dominance. So there may be a few laws around sexual assault, but they were oftentimes very minimal and very weak. But always it was about damaging a man's possession, his daughter, his wife, his sister. With the right to vote, it did lead to discussions around sexual violence and maternal rights to children. There were still many laws that enforced a large amount of control over women's autonomy and therefore her sexual autonomy. Like I said before, there used to be a law on the books that a woman couldn't walk down the streets alone at night without the accompaniment of a man, or else she would be arrested. So we owe a great big debt of gratitude to the second wave, second wave being starting from the 60s to the 80s, for really putting to the forefront women's sexual agency and truly addressing female sexual autonomy, as well as addressing in regards to what limits that, which is sexual violence, harassment, and objectification. The oncoming effect of birth control also contributed to this, as well. It also allowed for greater access to reproductive and sexual care. We're going to be focusing a lot more on that in the next module around reproductive justice, but I just wanted to mention it here. But we are still very much fighting against these battles in regards to feminist activism and scholarship around female sexual autonomy. Um, as many feminist authors have reminded us, in this, we are still very much divided by sexist thinking into the roles of either, as I'll explain later, virgin saint, Madonna whore, or sexy whore, which then leaves it so that women are basically giving a choiceless choice around their sexuality. They can either be one way, which is a virgin and virginal, or being sexually active, explicit, and desirable, i.e., a whore. And you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Of course, it's really important to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this more around intersectionality, because racism and the sexual objectification of women of color, indigenous women, and poor women have a long history here in the United States, right? And they kind of unfortunately go hand in hand. So, from the very beginning, when we were learning about sex, about our own sexual identities, our bodies, our feelings around pleasure or desire, we were learning a very gendered narrative. When we talk about someone's sexual autonomy, sexual activity, or sexuality, a question I want to ask you and I want you to think about is, does it make a difference if the person is a woman or a man? Like, if we say, if we were thinking about a scenario in regards to somebody hooking up, does the connotation differ if the person that we're talking about who's hooking up is a man or a woman? Do we praise one over the other? Do we shame one more than the other? And, with that, I want you to think about, as we unpack this more, about the lessons or messages you were told about your own sex and sexuality. And, we have these messages from not just from one source. We have them from our family and our community, our peers, the media, religion, education, and all these sort of images, media messages, and family messages, religious messages, all so forth, right? What does that do in regards to thinking about your own sex, your own sexuality? What does it help support? What does it help replicate? Talking about the debates within sex, and particularly sexuality and feminism, it's a very fraught area, because there's a lot of discussions and arguments around sexual autonomy, sexual exploitation, particularly in regards to the sexual politics in the feminist movement. So we can't go into it too much here, but I did want to talk about it in regards to that. In feminism, there's a lot of debates around sexuality. And some areas that have a really sort of heated conversation is around particular areas in regards to sexuality, such as sex work, also known as prostitution, pornography, and the sexual objectification of women. So, on the one hand, the second wave feminism, as much as they were advocating for women to be able to have rights to control their sexuality. So, for example, the birth control pill, was a big push to make it so that it was readily available. And second wave feminists were very much adamant in making sure that, so that a woman could control her reproductive choices, and therefore, for the first time ever, engage in sex without the fear of having a child. At the same time, the feminist movement of the second wave was also looking at, and that is still very much present today, the sexualization and objectification of women, which we've seen in the media module and misrepresentation about, that there's just still an abundance of this. And that, this leads to the sexual domination and exploitation of women, as well as violence and sex trafficking of women. So, a lot of feminists from the second wave were very much at a strong stance on a lot of things. And a lot of times they get lumped into being anti sex, in regards to, they were very much against pornography being very exploitative to women, eroticization of women, kink, as well as sex work. The debate is still going on, though the conversation, I think, has gotten a bit more complex and a bit more nuanced. Because the truth is that, while the second wave was very much fighting around exploitation of women, and did very much target pornography, sex workers, as well as just sexiness of women, the truth is that what we're really sort of focusing on is more about inequalities. Like, are we anti-sex, meaning anti-sex work, pornography, just sexualization, or are we anti the hierarchies and inequalities that causes exploitation to begin with? Because the truth is when we unpack this more, is sex work the problem? And I think you can argue that it is at the same time, or is it that sex workers are criminalized, therefore they have very little legal agency to be able to protect themselves, and in fact that causes more vulnerability for sex workers. That the majority of the labor is made by women, but mostly men profit from it. That's particularly true in the porn industry. And also the fact that, a lot of those who are against sex work and want to criminalize sex workers don't actually talk to sex workers and talk about what would be helpful for them. Same question can go to pornography. Is pornography necessarily the problem? Now, on one hand, you can argue, yes, it is, because when you look at a lot of mainstream pornography, it's very sexually aggressive and violent towards women. At the same time, you can sit back and be like, okay, well, is it all pornography, or is it really that we're asking that the majority of pornography is unrealistic and made for a male gaze? So maybe pornography itself isn't the problem, but maybe those who are producing it, we could get more diversity there, right? As well as the fact that, again, that the majority of labor is made by women, but mostly men profit from it. Maybe we should also start advocating about, instead of banning pornography, about having more opportunities for women to control that industry, which they are producing the most of it, but are not getting the profit from it. And same thing around wearing very sexually revealing clothing, or being sexual. Is it is that wearing sexy clothing or being sexually explicit, is that the problem? Now, some would say yes. I mean, it forces women to act this way when they might not to. And that is true. That would be a problem, right? You should never force somebody to act in a way that they don't want to act. That is going beyond a person's autonomy and consent. But just alone, if you want to wear like a sexually revealing outfit or so forth, is that the problem, or is it the fact that we live in a culture that sexually objectifies women, whether or not they choose to wear sexy clothing or not, right? To the point that a woman could be wearing a giant potato sack and could be sexually objectified. That's the larger problem. Is it patriarchy and the fact that we've created this gender hierarchy where women are objects and men are subjects? And that, women, regardless of if they want to dress sexy or not, which I think you should have that choice, never really have the option to opt out of being sexually objectified. So there's this new wave of feminism. Well, it started from the second wave, but it has grown in much more strength through the years, which is around sex positive feminism. Gail Rubin, who's an amazing queer anthropologist, is best known as an activist and theorist of sex and gender politics. And I'm just going to give a quote right there that, she has sort of looked at the feminist movement and said that there have been two strains of the feminist thought on the subject being sex. One tendency is criticize the restrictions on women's sexual behavior and denounce the high cost imposed on women for being sexually active. This tradition of feminist sexual thought has called for a sexual liberation that would work for women as well for men. The other, or the second tendency, has considered sexual liberalization to be inherently a mere extension of male privilege. This tradition resonates with conservative anti sexual discourse. And in what Gail Rubin sort of talks about, she kind of takes from the former rather than the later and says that patriarchy limits sexual expression, and therefore, in order to really address patriarchy and gender inequality and exploitation, we should instead sort of look at sex positive instead of sex negative and give in favor of people of all genders more sexual opportunities rather than restricting. So this gets into the heart of sex positive feminism, which is which started from the early 1980s, centering on the idea that sexual freedom is an essential component of a woman's freedom, and opposes legal or societal or social efforts to control sexual activities between consenting adults. That's very important, consenting adults. And embraces sexual minority groups, endorses the value of coalition between marginalized groups, and rejects the vilification of male sexuality and instead embraces the entire range of human sexuality. So, this module is very much taking on a sex positive approach in regards to looking at sex and particularly sexual images, as well as people really embracing and owning their own sexuality. It's not about condemning it. At the same time, we need to be critical in regards to how sex is both discussed, represented, taught, and so forth within our society, because it does do very harmful effects on individuals' own sense of self worth and their own sense of their own ownership over their sexuality. It's important to be, therefore, sexually literate, meaning to sort of look at the conversations, the discourses around sex and sexuality, particularly as it pertains to women. Because here's the truth, women and girls are often sent mixed messages around their sexuality. One from the media, obviously, but from other parts, right? From your family, communities, education, and so forth. I've mentioned this before, but oftentimes it comes into these two camps where women are sent these two mixed messages. One, a virgin whore, right? That you're either praised or you should be, virginal and save yourself for your significant other, usually towards marriage, Or you don't want to be a prude, right? You should therefore be sexually explicit, available, especially to male interest. And regardless of not whether you want to engage in sexual activity, consenting sexual activity or not, or so forth, many women, and particularly young women, have to face this dichotomy where they're damned if they're do, damned if they don't. They can never win in this game because no one is neither a virgin or a whore. They're made up categories, yet these sort of ideas around sexuality really do have a negative effect on how women think of their own sexuality. And, it goes hand in hand about how we treat, particularly discuss female sexuality, just alone in regards to female sexual organs, right? What is one of the biggest disses or insults you can give to somebody, particularly a man, is to call them a pussy, right? Or call somebody a cunt or etc., right? So we're literally insulting people by female anatomy. What does that make us think about that anatomy? There's also incredible amounts of stigma, shame, and jokes around female anatomy. And while you might all think it's harmless or you don't even think about it, if you really think about it, like if female anatomy is used in pretty much all the time in very negative ways, like insulting ways, or seen as a joke, or seen as gross or disgusting or weird or strange, how does that make young women and girls feel about their bodies? When literally something that they can't change, their anatomy, is being seen as disgusting, a joke, or an insult. How does that then affect somebody being able to feel ownership of their own sex? Of course, and this goes at the same time, while we are humiliating sexual anatomy of women, we are also heavily objectifying them, right? So, like, every part of them becomes objectified. And again, the thing about objectification versus just wanting to feel sexy and appear sexy is choice. Is that sexual objectification happens to women whether they choose to be sexy or not. And that in itself is the problem. There's also incredible amounts of discussions around how, particularly female sexuality, their very organs and body parts are not theirs but for their future husbands. I've had plenty of young women tell me that they were told, like, well, this is your husband's, only your husband can see this. So, what does that tell you? Again, I'm not knocking saving yourself towards marriage or having a monogamous relationship. That in itself is a choice, and I think it's a valuable choice that should be protected. But when you literally say that a piece of anatomy belongs to someone else, how do you then feel ownership over it? What this all goes is that, you know, it leaves a lot of women around the world to feel very sexually inhibited, yet at the same time, pressured to be sexual and feeling out of control or not having ownership over one's own sexuality. Even when things are marketed to us as being sexually explicit for women or bringing women into the discussions around sexuality, oftentimes it is misleading in the sense of that while, for example, 50 Shades of Grey was a very popular book and then film series, was all about a woman's sexual awakening and exploration, it also was very much cited towards the male character's wants, desires, and needs. And you can also kind of question how much sexual autonomy did the main character actually have over her own self. This gets to the heart of it is that, again, it's not about condemning the choices or the fantasies or the desires or wants of women. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's about allowing women, embracing women, encouraging women to discover those parts of themselves that have been denied, have been told that this is not ladylike, or this is dirty, or this is not unbecoming, and so forth. So it is about really, in many ways, when we talk about female sexuality, it's about reclaiming a woman's body for herself. And that is a struggle, right? That is a struggle to try to reclaim from the bombardment of messaging that women get around their sexuality and their sex and their bodies and so forth. It's not only the messaging that we get from our family and friends, but also the limited education that people get about sex education. So, for most of you, particularly if you're attending any schools that do have sex education, you have gotten some sort of form. But I'm going to safely assume that there was information that was missing. A lot of it being around female sexual pleasure, desires, and so forth. You might have gotten a good lesson around anatomy. Hopefully, you might have gotten even a good lesson around safe sex. But a lot of it is missing. And that is an issue. We have here in the United States a crisis around sex education. Only 22 states mandate sex education, with only 13 of those states requiring that the information be medically accurate, meaning basic medical information. Linda Barclay, American Sexual Education Association, talks about that we are doing such a poor job on so many subjects. We are not doing comprehensive sex ed. We are not doing condom demonstrations. We are not teaching young people about consent. We are making them feel bad about their bodies. And this has direct effect on sexual health and so forth. Just this year alone, there's been about 50,000 new HIV infections, 20 million new STI infections, 3 million unintended pregnancies, and 1 million rapes annually is the direct result of the insufficient way we talk about sex with young people. Barclay then goes on to say that if we as a nation could provide sex education in a positive, open, accepting, comprehensive, and accurate manner, we would be raising our children to say things like to not say things like we need to defund Planned Parenthood because sexual health, women's health, queer health, and the right to choose would be so respected within our culture. Sex education is one critical intervention that we can do in regards to challenging these very damaging narratives and understanding around sex, female sexuality, and so forth. But unfortunately, sex education is not the only way that people learn about sex. Pornography, especially the mass distribution of porn on the internet, has made it so that a lot of people learn about sex and sexuality and sex acts through porn, creating a very skewed version of what sex could look like because it is all very staged. And the videos assigned for this week will also discuss the impact of porn on particularly young women's ideas around their sexuality. This is all to say, again, that, at the heart of this struggle is around reclaiming bodies, it is around addressing sexual exploitation and really seeing the links. It's not about condemning people for being sexually active or not sexually active. It is not about condemning a sex work industries or pornography, but it is about talking about power hierarchies and structures. Okay, see you next time.